At 35,000 feet, there's nowhere to run. For a man used to the open asphalt of the Redline, being strapped into seat 14C felt like a cage. I was flying to Seattle to save a friend's rig from the bank, but the flight attendant had other plans. She didn't just deny me the meal I'd paid for, she mocked the ink on my arm and told me people like me didn't belong in the real future of this country. Then the storm hit. Violent turbulence snapped her service cart, sending a heavy leather folder into my lap. It wasn't a flight manifest, it was a ledger of offshore accounts and illegal port schedules. The mocking look in her eyes turned to pure terror. She'd just insulted the one man who knew exactly what to do when things go south. Injustice doesn't care about your zip code or your altitude. You're watching Highway Stories Untold. When the world turns a blind eye to the truth, strong souls like you step up, drop your experiences in the comments and inspire the fight. The flight out of O'Hare was delayed 3 hours, which in the world of logistics is a lifetime. I'd spent that time sitting on a hard plastic chair near gate B12, watching the rain smear the windows and thinking about the rig waiting for me in Seattle. It was a 1994 W900. A beautiful piece of iron that deserved better than a repo lot. My friend Miller had served with me in the 101st before he went into independent hauling. He'd hit a string of bad luck, a blown engine in the Rockies followed by a medical scare, and he was drowning. I told him I'd get his truck to a buyer I knew in Montana who'd pay him a fair price, enough to clear his debts and keep his house. That was the mission. Simple. But as I finally boarded the plane, I felt that familiar itch between my shoulder blades. The cabin was crowded, filled with tech types in expensive hoodies and suit and tie types who looked like they'd never had grease under their fingernails. I took my seat in 14C, an aisle spot. I'm a big man, 6'4", and built like a bridge piling. So these tiny coach seats are a special kind of purgatory. I tried to make myself small, tucking my elbows in and resting my hands on my thighs. The woman in the middle seat next to me was young, maybe early 20s, wearing a faded nursing school sweatshirt. She looked terrified, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. I gave her a small, tight smile, the kind I use to let people know I'm not a threat despite the size. "First time flying?" I asked, my voice low. "No," she whispered, her eyes darting to the window where lightning flickered in the distance. "Just a bad time to be leaving home." I nodded. I knew that feeling. I glanced down at my own arm, where the sleeves of my flannel were rolled up. On my right forearm is a tattoo I've had since I was 21. It's an old-school eagle perched on a red line, with the coordinates of a valley in Afghanistan where I lost some good men. It's not a decoration, it's a ledger. That's when the lead flight attendant arrived with the meal cart. Her name tag said, Elena. She was impeccably groomed, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She was moving down the aisle with a practiced, robotic efficiency, handing out pre-ordered meals. When she got to my row, I held out my voucher. I'd paid the extra $30 for the premium navigator meal because I knew I wouldn't have time to eat once I landed. Elena looked at the voucher, then her eyes traveled slowly up my arm, lingering on the tattoo. Her expression didn't just change, it hardened. It was a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice loud enough for the rows around us to hear. "There seems to be a problem with your order." "A problem?" I asked calmly. "It's a confirmed voucher, purchased 48 hours ago." "The system shows it was flagged for payment inconsistency," she said, her lip curling. She didn't look at the voucher again. She looked at my face, then back at the tattoo. "And honestly, given the patriotic display on your arm, I'm sure you're used to making sacrifices for the greater good. We're actually short on meals in the cabin, and I've decided to reassign yours to a gentleman in first class who had a late booking. He's a venture capitalist helping to fund the green transition. I'm sure a man of your background understands priority." The nursing student next to me gasped. A man across the aisle, wearing a tailored navy blazer, chuckled softly and looked back at his tablet. I felt the heat rise in my neck, but I kept my voice steady. "That's the Redline way. You don't give them the explosion they're looking for. The gentleman in first class didn't pay for my meal, Elena. I did. And my background taught me that taking something that doesn't belong to you is called theft, regardless of what you call the person you're stealing from. Elena leaned down, her face inches from mine. The mask of professional courtesy was gone. "Listen to me, Major," she hissed, spotting the faint scar on my temple. "You people think you own the world because you spent some time in the dirt. But up here, I'm the one in charge. You're just a cargo-class passenger with a glorified ink stain. You aren't getting a meal, and if you say another word, I'll have the air marshal remove you the second we touch down for interfering with flight crew duties. Do we have a deal?" She didn't wait for an answer. She slammed the cart into gear and pushed it forward, but the universe has a way of balancing the scales. We hit the first wall of the storm. The plane didn't just shake, it dropped. It felt like the floor had been cut out from under us. Oxygen masks didn't drop, but the overhead bins groaned, and the service cart, which Elena hadn't properly locked in her haste to move away from me, bucked violently. Elena screamed as she lost her footing, sliding backward. The cart hit a seat edge and tilted. A heavy black leather folio, the kind used for high-level manifestos and flight logs, flew off the top shelf. It sailed through the air and landed squarely in my lap, splaying open. I reached down to steady it, my trucker's instinct for securing a load kicking in. But as I went to close it, my eyes caught a glimpse of the top page. It wasn't a manifest, it was a series of wire transfer confirmations. 6 figures each, and at the bottom of the page, highlighted in yellow, was a name I recognized from the news, a local politician in Seattle who was currently overseeing the port expansion Miller's buyer worked out of. Beneath the name was a handwritten note. "Cargo cleared. No inspections at Pier 42. Courier on Flight 742. Look for the vest." I looked up. Eleanor was scrambling to her feet, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the folder in my lap. The disdain was gone. In its place was a cold, sharp terror. "Give that to me," she commanded, but her voice hovered on the edge of a crack. I didn't give it back. I closed the folder slowly, my large hand covering the entire cover. "I think there's been an inconsistency in your paperwork, Elena," I said, my voice like gravel on a low-speed turn. "And I think I just found out why you're so worried about the real future of this country." The plane bucked again, harder this time. The lights flickered and died, leaving us in the eerie, strobing glow of the lightning outside. In that moment, the cabin felt very small, and the stakes felt very, very high. The cabin lights didn't stay off for long. The emergency backup kicked in, bathing the interior in a sickly, dim orange glow that made everyone look like they were made of wax. The storm was still clawing at the wings, and the fasten seatbelt sign chimed twice, a lonely sound in the middle of the chaos. Elena was still standing over me, her composure had completely fractured. The professional, icy mask had melted away, leaving behind something frantic and jagged. She reached for the leather folder, her fingers trembling. "Give that back," she said again, but this time it wasn't a command, it was a plea. "You have no idea what you're holding. You're out of your depth, trucker. I spent 20 years hauling hazardous materials through ice storms and over mountain passes where a 6-inch mistake means a funeral," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying over the drone of the engines. "I've been out of my depth since the day I took my oath. The difference is I know how to swim. You look like you're drowning." I didn't give her the folder. Instead, I tucked it firmly between my hip and the side of the seat, pinning it down. I looked over at the nursing student next to me. She was hyperventilating, her eyes fixed on the flickering lights. I reached over and placed a hand on the armrest, not touching her, but creating a boundary. "Breathe," I told her. "The plane is built for this. It's just air. It's got nowhere to go but around us." She looked at me, and for a second she found a bit of an anchor in my voice. She nodded, taking a ragged breath. Eleanor saw the opening. She turned toward the front of the plane, likely headed for the internal phone to call for help, or to alert whoever was waiting for that folder. But before she could take 2 steps, the man in the navy blazer, the one who'd laughed at me earlier, unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up with a fluid, predatory grace that didn't match his expensive outfit. "Is there a problem, Elena?" he asked. His voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely devoid of warmth. Elena stopped. She looked at him, then back at me. He has the manifest, Mr. Vance. The Turbulence. It fell. Vance didn't look at Elena. He looked at me. He had the eyes of a man who viewed people as line items on a balance sheet. He stepped into the aisle, blocking the path toward the cockpit. "Mr. Mercer, isn't it? Jack Redline Mercer. I did a quick search when you started causing a scene about your meal. You have quite the reputation in the Pacific Northwest. A man of principles. A man who likes to help his friends." He took a step closer, ignoring the way the plane jolted. He held onto the overhead bins for balance, looming over me. "I happen to be an associate of the person who owns that folder. It's a private business matter, very sensitive, very high stakes. I'm sure a man who's trying to save his friend's trucking business could appreciate the value of a timely favor." "A favor?" I asked. I could feel the weight of the folder against my side. "Is that what you call bribing port officials to look the other way while you move cargo through Pier 42? Vance's expression didn't flicker. "I call it streamlining the future. The world is changing, Jack. People like you, people who live by outdated codes and work with their hands, you're the friction in the machine. We're just trying to reduce that friction. Now, hand over the folder, and when we land, I'll personally see to it that your friend Miller's debts vanish. Not just the truck, Jack, the house, the medical bills, all of it. One folder for a man's life. That's a trade even a trucker can understand." I looked at him, and I saw the rot. It's the same rot I've seen in corrupt dispatchers, in crooked cops, and in the politicians who send boys to die in valleys they can't find on a map. They think everything has a price. They think because they can buy the world, they can buy the soul of the man standing in it. "You've got one thing right, Vance," I said, unbuckling my own seatbelt. I stood up slowly. I'm a few inches taller than him, and a lot wider. The aisle felt even smaller now. I do like to help my friends. But Miller wouldn't want a house bought with the kind of blood money that requires no inspections at a seaport. He's a man who sleeps soundly because his hands are clean. I think I'll keep the folder. Vance's eyes went cold. He didn't shout. He didn't lunge. He just reached into his blazer and pulled out a small, discreet radio. "We have a situation in 14C, he said into it. "The passenger is non-compliant. Initiate the protocol." Suddenly, the gentleman from first class, the one who'd supposedly taken my meal, appeared at the curtain dividing the cabins. He wasn't a venture capitalist. He was built like a professional middleweight, with the flat, scarred knuckles of a brawler. Behind him, another man stood up from the back of the plane. They were boxing me in. The nursing student let out a small whimper. The rest of the passengers were frozen, sensing the shift in the air. The plane took another violent dip, sending Elena sprawling into the galley. "You're a long way from your truck, Jack," Vance said, stepping back to let his muscle move in. "No dashcam, no witnesses who will talk. Just a tragic accident during a storm." I felt the old, familiar hum in my blood, the calm before the gears lock into place. I didn't have my rig, and I didn't have my tools, but I had the folder, and I had the truth. "I've spent my life hauling heavy loads through bad weather," I said, bracing my feet against the seat bases. "And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that when the wind starts blowing this hard, the things that aren't tied down, they tend to get swept away." The man from first class lunged. He was fast, but he didn't understand the physics of a moving cabin. As the plane tilted left, he overcompensated. I didn't punch him. I just moved my shoulder, letting his own momentum carry him into the hard edge of the exit road doorframe. There was a sickening thud, and he slumped to the floor. But the man from the back was closing in, and Vance was reaching for something else in his pocket. I was one man in a metal tube, surrounded by people who'd sold their souls for a seat at the table. I looked at the nursing student. "Get down," I ordered. Then I turned to face the rest of the storm. The cabin was a pressure cooker. Between the screaming wind outside and the heavy silence of the passengers watching three men surround me, the air felt thick enough to choke on. The man from the back, a thick-necked guy with a jagged scar across his chin, didn't wait for a signal. He moved with the practiced clumsiness of a barroom brawler, swinging a heavy fist toward my jaw. I didn't retreat. In a truck cab or a narrow aisle, space is your most valuable asset. I stepped into the punch, catching his bicep with my forearm to kill the momentum and driving my palm into the center of his chest. It wasn't a strike meant to kill, it was meant to displace. He hit the opposite seat row with a grunt, his head snapping back against the headrest. "Sit down," I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the engines. "Before the turbulence does it for you." Vance was backing away toward the galley, his face a mask of calculated fury. He wasn't a fighter, but he was a director. He looked at Elena, who was clutching a service handset. "Call the cockpit," Vance barked. "Tell them we have a passenger assault in progress. Tell the marshal to move now." I knew what that meant. In the post-9/11 world, an assault on a flight isn't handled with a talking to. It's handled with zip ties and federal charges. If I didn't end this before we touched the tarmac, the folder wouldn't matter. I'd be in a holding cell while Vance's cargo disappeared into the fog of the Seattle docks. I reached down and grabbed the leather folder, but I didn't just hold it. I flipped it open to the center, where a plastic sleeve held a series of high-resolution photographs. My heart skipped a beat as I looked at them. They weren't just shots of a port. They were photos of shipping containers marked with the seal of a major medical relief organization, the kind that ships vaccines and emergency supplies to disaster zones. But tucked into the corners of the crates, barely visible behind the pallets of medicine, were black rectangular cases. I'd seen those cases before in the Kandahar markets. They were high-end, untraceable small arms. "You're moving rifles in relief crates," I said, looking at Vance. The realization hit me like a head-on collision. "That's why you need no inspections. You're using a charity as a shroud for a ghost shipment." The nursing student next to me gasped, her eyes going wide as she saw the photos. The man in the navy blazer who had laughed earlier suddenly looked very small. He started fumbling with his phone, trying to record, but Vance's third man, the one who'd hit the doorframe, was shaking off the cobwebs. He lunged for the phone, smashing it out of the passenger's hand. "Nobody records anything!" Vance screamed, his composure finally snapping. The plane took a sudden, stomach-churning roll to the right. The fasten seatbelt sign didn't just chime, it started flashing. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, tight and strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing severe atmospheric instability. Flight attendants, take your jump seats immediately. This is not a drill." Elena ignored the order. She was staring at me, her hand hovering over the phone. I saw the conflict in her eyes. She wasn't a killer. She was an opportunist. She'd been bought. But the weight of what she was helping to move was finally sinking in. "Elena," I said, keeping my eyes on Vance's muscle, "you took the money because you thought it was just corporate skimming. You thought you were just helping a venture capitalist bypass some red tape. Look at the photos." I held the folder up. "Those aren't green energy components. Those are tools for making orphans. If this plane goes down, or if we land and you stay silent, those crates hit the street. Every life taken with those belongs to you. Is that the future you were talking about?" "Shut up!" Vance yelled. He reached into his blazer, and this time he didn't pull out a radio. It was a compact, polymer frame pistol. The sight of it sent the cabin into a frenzy of screams. "Vance, put it away!" Elena shrieked. "Not here, you'll breach the hull!" "He's not going to breach anything," I said, stepping forward, my hands open and visible. I was the only thing between that gun and the rest of the passengers. He's a man of spreadsheets and margins. He knows that if he fires that, he dies too. He's just scared, because for the first time in his life, he's facing a cargo he can't manage. Vance's hand was shaking. The turbulence was getting worse, the floor beneath us bucking like a wild horse. "I'll kill you, Mercer. I'll say you tried to storm the cockpit. I'm the one they'll believe. Look at you, you're nothing. You're a ghost of a dead industry." "Maybe," I said, "but even ghosts can leave a mark." I saw the man from the back, the one I'd pushed, crawling toward my legs, trying to trip me so Vance could get a clear shot. I had seconds. I looked at the nursing student. "When I move," I whispered, "pull the emergency floor lighting strip. Give me 3 seconds of dark." She didn't hesitate. She reached down for the maintenance tab at the base of the seat. "Jack!" Vance yelled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Go!" I said. The lights didn't just go out, they vanished. The cabin plunged into a chaotic, strobe-lit nightmare as the lightning outside provided the only illumination. I didn't move toward Vance. I moved toward the service cart. The darkness in the cabin was total for 3 heartbeats, save for the strobe light pulses of lightning bleeding through the window shades. In that jagged electrical flicker, the world became a series of still frames. Frame 1, Vance squinting at the sudden void. Frame 2, the nursing student ducking low. Frame 3, me moving with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a runaway freight train on a 6% grade. I didn't head for Vance's gun. In a confined space, a man with a shaking hand and a firearm is a hazard to everyone, himself included. If I lunged for the weapon and missed, or if we wrestled for it, a stray round could punch through a window or a hydraulic line. Instead, I used the darkness to reach the service cart Elena had abandoned. I grabbed the heavy industrial coffee carafe, the one made of reinforced steel, and the thick nylon-braided strap used to secure the cart to the floor during takeoff. When the emergency floor strips flickered back to life, I wasn't where Vance expected me to be. I was crouched in the aisle 2 rows up, the folder tucked into the small of my back under my belt. "Where is he?" Vance screamed, his voice cracking like dry wood. He was spinning in a circle, the barrel of the pistol waving wildly. "Mercer, show yourself or I start shooting these people. I'll do it. I've got nothing to lose." The man with the scarred chin was back on his feet, his face bloody from where I'd checked him earlier. He saw me first. He let out a guttural roar and charged, his boots thudding against the carpeted floor. He was aiming to tackle me, to pin me against the seat so Vance could finish the job. I didn't give him the chance. I swung the nylon strap like a lash, catching him across the shins. As his legs went out from under him, I stepped into his space, grabbed the back of his tactical vest, because that's what he was wearing under his civilian jacket, I realized then, and used his own weight to heave him toward Vance. They collided in a tangle of limbs and expensive fabric. The gun went off, a deafening crack that sounded like a whip snapping inside a drum. The bullet didn't hit anyone. It buried itself in the thick padding of the first-class bulkhead. The scream that followed wasn't from a passenger. It was from Elena. She was huddled by the galley, her hands over her ears. "Enough!" I roared. My voice isn't just loud, it's a physical force, the kind of bark developed over decades of shouting over idling diesel engines and shouting commands in the valley. It filled the cabin, vibrating the very air. Vance was scrambling to find his footing, his glasses gone, his face a mask of primal, cornered animal fear. He found the gun on the floor and lunged for it. I was faster. I didn't hit him. I simply put my boot, a size 13 steel toe, directly onto his hand. I didn't crush it. Not yet. But I applied enough pressure to let him know that the world he thought he controlled had just shrunk down to the square inch of flesh beneath my heel. "The game is over, Vance," I said, leaning down so my face was inches from his. The plane took another violent dip, sending us both sliding a few inches, but I kept my weight centered. "You talked about the future. You talked about people like me being friction. Well, here's the thing about friction. It's what keeps you on the road. Without it, you're just a disaster looking for a place to happen. And today, I'm the wall you finally hit." The man from the back tried to rise one last time, but the man in the navy blazer, the one who'd laughed at me earlier, suddenly found his spine. He and another passenger, a guy who looked like he spent his weekends at a CrossFit gym, piled onto the muscle, pinning him to the floor. "We've got him, Jack," the blazer guy yelled. He wasn't laughing anymore. He looked like a man who had just realized there was more to life than the numbers on his tablet. I looked back at Vance. He was sobbing now, a pathetic, wet sound. "You don't understand," he wheezed. "The people I work for, they don't lose. If that folder reaches Seattle, I'm a dead man." "Then I guess you should have stayed in the green transition business," I said. I looked up at the front of the cabin. The cockpit door had opened. A man in a plainclothes suit, the air marshal who had been sitting in the very back, waiting for the right moment to move through the chaos, stepped out. He had his badge out and his weapon drawn, but his eyes were on me. He saw the way I was holding the folder, the way I was protecting the passengers, and the way I was holding Vance down. "Marshal," I said, nodding toward the folder, "you're going to want to see this. It's a manifest for a ghost shipment at Pier 42, small arms, masked as medical relief." The marshal looked at the folder, then at Vance, then back at me. He didn't lower his gun, but his stance relaxed. "And who are you?" "Just a driver," I said, "taking a long-haul flight to pick up a friend's rig." The next hour was a blur of adrenaline and procedure. The pilot managed to wrestle the plane through the heart of the storm and onto the tarmac at SeaTac. We didn't taxi to the gate. We were met on a remote strip by a fleet of black SUVs with blue and red lights that cut through the Seattle rain. As the passengers were being led off the plane, the nursing student stopped beside me. She was still shaky, but the terror was gone. She reached out and touched the tattoo on my arm, the eagle and the red line. "Thank you," she whispered. I thought nobody cared about what happens to people like us anymore." "There's always someone watching the road," I told her. I watched them lead Vance and his muscle away in zip ties. Elena was taken too, though she was crying and talking to a federal agent, likely trying to trade what she knew for a shorter sentence. The air marshal stayed with me until the very end. He handed me my bag, which had been retrieved from the overhead bin. "Mr. Mercer," he said, shaking my hand, "that folder is going to take down a very large, very ugly network. You probably saved a lot of lives today, not just on this plane. I just wanted my meal, Marshal," I said with a dry smile. He laughed, a short, tired sound. "Tell you what, there's a diner about 3 miles from the airport, best steak and eggs in the state. I'll give you a ride." "I appreciate it," I said, looking out at the rain-slicked runway, "but I've got a 1994 W900 waiting for me. I've stayed in one place for too long as it is." I walked out of the terminal and into the cool, damp air of the Pacific Northwest. My joints still ached and my stomach was empty, but as I hailed a cab to take me to the repo lot where Miller's truck was sitting, I felt the weight lift. I found the truck in the back corner of the lot, covered in a thin layer of grime, but still looking proud. I climbed into the cab, the smell of old leather and diesel greeting me like an old friend. I turned the key, and when that big cat engine roared to life, it drowned out the memory of the wind and the screams. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I sent a simple text to Miller. "The rig is moving. Your house is safe. See you in 48 hours. I pulled out of the lot, the long nose of the truck pointing toward the mountains. The road was open, the lights of the dashboard were glowing soft green, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt like it was back on its axis. People think that being a trucker is just about moving freight from point A to point B. They think it's a job for people who can't do anything else. But they don't see the lines we hold. They don't see the way we watch over the miles while the rest of the world sleeps. Vance was right about one thing. The world is changing. It's getting faster, colder, and more complicated. But as long as there's a red line on the map and a man willing to hold it, there's still hope for the rest of us. I shifted into fourth, the gears clicking into place with a satisfying mechanical finality. I had a long way to go, and the weather wasn't getting any better. But that was fine. I've always done my best work in the storm. I drove through the Snoqualmie Pass as the sun began to bleed over the jagged peaks of the Cascades. The W900 hummed beneath me, a steady, rhythmic vibration that seemed to settle the restless energy still buzzing in my nerves from the flight. There's a specific kind of peace you find in a truck cab after a storm, a sense that no matter how chaotic the world gets, the road remains. I thought about the folder, now in the hands of federal agents, and the crates at Pier 42 that would never reach their destination. I thought about Vance, a man who viewed the world from 30,000 feet and saw nothing but pawns and profit. Men like him think they're the ones moving the world, but they're just riding on the backs of people they don't understand. The real world isn't found in a first-class cabin or an offshore ledger. It's found in the tired eyes of a nursing student trying to make a better life, and in a man like Miller who'd rather lose his house than his integrity. As the miles unspooled before me, I realized that the red line isn't just a mark on a gauge or a tattoo on my arm. It's the boundary between the people who build and the people who break. Every time we stand up, every time we refuse to let a bully dictate the terms, we're thickening that line. I'm just a trucker, a man who carries the weight so others don't have to, but as long as I've got air in my lungs and a gear to shift, I'll be out here, making sure the right things get where they're going. The road is long and the burden is heavy, but the view from the driver's seat is finally clear. The road is long, but you don't have to drive it alone. If you believe in standing for what's right, subscribe and join our community. Let's keep the truth moving. See you on the next haul. Stay safe out there.